Hey everyone, welcome to this section. In this section, we'll discuss regarding the next topic of Palo Alto Firewall, which is user ID. So far, we have discussed regarding the features of content ID, the features of application ID or app ID. Now, let's discuss about the topic of user ID. Okay, so it is an important topic, and so let's start with the overview of the user ID in Palo Alto Firewall. Okay, now user ID, as we know, it is a feature in Palo Alto Network Firewall that enables the visibility and control over your network traffic based on user identities rather than just IP addresses, right? So you are going to write down the security policies, and in the security policy you will reference the user ID information rather than just IP addresses, because if you write down the policies using IP addresses, let us say the user can change the IP address, and the user can get access to the network, right? So rather, to make it much more secure, you can define user ID into your security policies. Okay, so it will help your organization enforce your security policy based on user roles, its departments, and its group memberships as well, right? So what are the key features that you get into your user ID? So key features that we have in your user ID, the first point is user identification, which means you can map the network traffic to specific users. So map the network traffic to specific users by integrating with directory services like Active Directory, also called as AD. You can leverage LDAP, you can leverage Radius, Kerberos, etc., right? Also you can leverage local databases. So there are multiple methods by which you can identify or authenticate the user. Second step or second feature, it's policy enforcement. So you will be configuring the security policies. So I can say allow security policies to be applied based on user groups rather than just IP addresses. Because let's say if you have allowed a traffic or you have blocked a traffic using an IP address in your security policy, but what if that user changes the IP address, okay, and can get access to the network? Okay, so you are making it much more granular by writing the policies with respect to user identification. Third point is user-based logging and reporting, which means you will have the ability now to provide detailed logs and reports. So provide detailed logs and reports of the user activities for better visibility and also to maintain compliance. Okay, Fourth feature is integration with various authentication mechanism. So integration with authentication mechanisms, which means that Palo Alto Firewall supports various authentication methods such as Kerberos, NTLM, captive portal for user verification. So there are various methods that you can use. The fifth feature what you get is something called as the mapping methods. That means that Palo Alto Firewall can use multiple methods like Active Directory monitoring. So it uses multiple methods like Active Directory monitoring, syslog parsing, and agent-based identification to track the users, right? So that means if the user is John, if the user is Bob, then only they are going to be allowed to access, let us say, social networking pages. So we are not considering the IP addresses. Along with IP addresses, you are considering the user ID as well. So that means by implementing this user ID, organizations can definitely enhance the security. It will simplify the policy management and of course gain better insight into the user behavior onto their network. So similarly you have got, so when you work with user ID, you can go ahead and configure captive portal configuration in your Palo Alto Firewall. So captive portal, as we know, captive portal in Palo Alto firewalls, it is used to authenticate the users before granting access to the network resources. So it will redirect the users to a web-based authentication page when they will try to attempt to access the internet or any other protected resource. So you have seen this in hotels or in any public places. So you have let us say you want to access let us say some internet resource. So first you get redirected to a captive portal page where you fill up your details, and once you enter the right credentials, then you are granted access for a particular period of time to access any internet resources, right? So there are multiple steps that you can configure to that you can take to configure this captive portal authentication, right? So the first thing first is you can go to the users. So in your Palo Alto Firewall, you can go to the device tab. In the device tab, you have got something called as the local user database. So right in the left hand side, you find there is local user database where you can see there is users and groups. So when you click on users, so when you click on users over here, so you can go ahead and create, you can go ahead and define the users. For example, let us say John, Jacob, something like that. So let us say I add some users over here. Let's say Bob is one user, and I define a password for Bob, and this password should be an 8 characters long. So 1 second, let me define a password for Bob. I confirm that particular password. I enable that user, click on OK. Likewise, let's say I select one more, say it's Mary. I define a password for Mary as well. All right, so we have defined multiple users in this particular user database, right? So Bob and Mary has been created, and we can now do one thing. We can actually place these users in a particular group. Okay, so these users can be defined in this user groups, the next tab. And let's say I create a user group called as let us say network admin. They're the network admin, or let's say I define they are the guest users, something like that, okay, as an example. And you can actually, the group name is guest users group. Okay, so guest users, let us say group 1, and you can add that user, say Bob and Mary, into that particular user group and click on OK. So you can see that we have made a guest user group over here, and we have defined this particular user Bob and Mary inside this particular user group, right? So once you are done with this, that means you can go ahead and apply the respective policies for this particular group of users, which is Bob and Mary, right? So the second step, let me write down these steps over here. So the first step is creating the user IDs and allocating, or I can say associating, the users into the users group. That's the first thing, right? Second thing is to create the authentication profile. Okay, so where in the same device section you can just scroll up and you can see there is authentication profile, which is right here just below this admin roles. So select authentication profile, and you can define one authentication profile for the users that you want to create. So when you click on add, you can name it, let us say my auth profile 1, and these are the parameters. Like for authentication, you can define the type, and we Palo Alto Firewall supports different types of authentication mechanism by which the user can be authenticated against. So you can have radius based authentication, you can use LDAP authentication, SAML based authentication, right, which will where you can integrate any SAML 2.0 authenticators or IDPs, right, to authenticate the user against. Kerberos supported, TechX Plus is supported. Yeah, so there are multiple things that you can do. So what we are doing here is a local database based authentication. So I define local database here, and then you can define the multi MFA factors, right? If you want to define multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, you can define that. So not only based on username and password, let's say you want to authenticate based on some OTPs, so you can define that as well. Just for lab purpose, I'm ignoring this, but you can define it over here. Okay, click on advanced, and now you can actually go ahead and call the respective users inside this particular allow list. So you can see, if you do click on add, you can allow all the users, or you can allow a particular user in that authentication profile, right? So let's say I allow this particular user group 1, which contains Bob and Mary, okay, which is part of that particular group. All right, so you can define the account lockout period. So the account lockout period, one second. Yep, so you can define the account lockout. So how many failed attempts you want that the user should try. Let's say 5 failed attempts. After that, the account will be locked. And you can define the lockout time. Let's say it's 1 minute, right? until that particular timer expires, the user cannot go for any reattempt for any authentication or resupply the credentials, right? So yeah, so once this is done, click on OK. That means your authentication profile is now ready. So you made the authentication profile, which is based on this particular user group, right? So you can apply this particular user means you can create the authentication profile for all the users also if you want. In that case, it will be applied for all the users in all the users group. Okay, but in my case, I'm creating this Bob and Mary, defining that into one user group and calling that user group inside this authentication profile. So my second step is creating the authentication profile for users, and creating the authentication method. In my case, I have used the local database. Okay, so next step would be to go ahead and configure your authentication or captive portal based configuration, right? So the next step would be to go ahead and configure the captive portal page, which is right under authentication profile. You have got a place called as user identification. That's your third step. And in this user identification, you have got different components like user mapping, connection security, etc., etc., trusted source address, where this is the one. So authentication portal settings, you can define that. You can just edit this, and you can define enable authentication portal. You can define the idle timer value, so how long the user can be idle without once it is authenticated, how long it will be idle, or how long it can be idle without needing for re-authentication. How long after authentication you want to grant him internet access, let's say 60 minutes or 1 hour, but you can change that if you want it, right? So yeah, so in that case you can call this SSL or TLS service profile, right? Or you can, the most important thing is to call this authentication profile which you have made, that is my auth profile over here, and then certificate profile. If you want, you can create that, but as of now, just for lab purpose, I'm just defining it. Okay, so your authentication profile has been created here. All right, so this is going to be your third step, where you define this authentication portal parameters. You define the idle timer. You can define the authentication profile into it, right? And one important thing is in this particular setting, I have forgotten to choose this mode. This mode should be redirect mode. So when you click on redirect mode, that means this particular user, let's say my LAN users, once they want to authenticate and they want to go with user ID authentication, their interface should be Ethernet 1/1, right? So when this user is sending traffic to internet, that means the traffic should land at Ethernet 1/1, and the Ethernet 1/1 should provoke the user with the user ID or the captive portal page, and the IP address is 10.1.1.2.0.1, right? So in that case, you should do a redirect. You can just define the redirect host IP address over here. Okay, you can define the redirect IP address over here, which is, in my case, it is 10.1.1.2.0.1, right? So I define that as 10.1.1.2.0.1. Okay, so once you are done with defining this, then you need to also create this particular let us say we can go to the interfaces. Okay, click on OK there. Then you can go to the network. You can go to the interfaces, and you can define Ethernet 1/1. Okay, you can just go inside it, and you know that inside the advanced section you have got a management profile which you have defined, right? So this management profile is MGMT profile, and this particular MGMT profile that you have, it is part of that interface management profile which you have defined it earlier. So if I go to interface management, click on this management profile, and you can see, you know, I have to enable this response page, I have to enable this user ID in that particular management profile so that the user ID page is actually represented to me, right? So this is important. Alright, so now you can see that the response page and the user ID has been allowed in this particular management profile. So this would be your, you know, the third step. That means you are going to configure the or you can say not configure, create, right? Create the captive portal settings under, which is basically under this feature called as user identification, right? And then you need to create the management profile to allow or to activate the user ID and the response page. All right, so this is important. So once this is done, then you have to go to the next step, which is basically the zone where the user is located, right? So the user is located in that particular source zone, which is the trust zone, and activate user ID on that particular trust zone, right? So let's go to the network, and if you look for the zones, then you have got this trust zone. Inside the trust zone you have this enable user identification, enable device identification, which is, you know, disabled by default, this tabs. So let's enable those two. All right, and you can add the include list as well if you want it, right? So if you want to add the include list, you can do that over here. Okay, so let's just click on OK. So you can see that under this particular trust zone, you can see user ID is enabled on that particular trust zone, right? So this will be your next step, which is the fifth step, is to enabling the user ID and activating in the source, which in our case is a trust zone. All right, so this is one of the important step that you should, a lot of people misses this, but make sure you follow this particular step. So the next step would be to go and create this, you know, authentication enforcement, which is under your objects. So click on objects, you have this place called as authentication over here in the left side, just below log forwarding, and you can see there are three in authentication enforcement, which is predefined. So the authentication methods are web form, browser challenge, and no captive portal. But if you want, you can actually select that and clone that and, you know, modify it to yourself. But let's say I click on add, I define, you know, let us say ZBN authentication. I can say authentication method is web form, authentication profile is that my auth profile one, which I've created, and I can define this customized message, right? So if you want, you know, any sort of your message, you can actually put it over here, which the user will get in their, you know, browser page or the captive portal page. So click on OK for that. And once this is done, this admin authentication is configured properly, and you can see the authentication method is web based or web form based, and the authentication profile is created. The next job, so let me write it down. So number 6 is create or creating the authentication mechanism and calling the authentication profile. Okay, the seventh step is to create the authentication based security policy. Okay, authentication based security policy, or I should say user ID authentication based security policy. All right, to do that I have to go to my policies tab over here, and right below this application override I have got an authentication policy that I can define. So click on add, where you can define the name. Let's say it is guest user auth captive portal policy. Right, you can define some tags or descriptions of your choice. The source zone, say it is a trust zone. The source address in my case will be that LAN 10.1.1.0. The source user, you can define the source user over here, which is the guest group, the guest users group 1. Right, along with that the source device, let's say, is any. The destination user over here, let's say I just remove this particular source user as of now. I'm doing like local DB authentication, so that's fine. So I can just define the destination over here, the destination zone as untrust, destination address, say it's any service URL. Only HTTP is allowed, so I can allow HTTP and HTTPS both. Okay, and any URL category, and here the authentication enforcement which you have done, right? Authentication enforcement is at ZBIN authentication. So here authentication enforcement mechanism is that right word, enforcement mechanism, enforcement. Yeah. All right, so you have defined the authentication enforcement that you have called here. Define the timeout if you want. You can take care about the log forwarding. Click on OK. So your there is okay, so this is guest user auth CP policy. Yeah. All right, so I can go ahead and I can save the changes or commit the changes. So I hope it is clear. So let's go ahead and commit those changes respectively. Okay, and wait for the commit to take place. So these are the different steps which you take to configure any user ID based authentication with respect to captive portal. All right, so the commit has been completed successfully here, and you can just note one thing that I just blocked or disabled this blockfb.com that we had earlier configured, and I just enable this particular rule on the top. So internet access, the source zone is trust and untrust, any zone to any zone, let's say, and any applications are allowed, right? So yeah, so now what you can do is you can go to let us say from my topology I can go to the Win server VM over here, which is sitting on the trust zone, and from that particular Win server VM, let's say I want to access certain web pages. So if I look for its IP address, first of all, IP config, I see it's having an IP of 10.1.1.16, and if I want to ping 8888, pings are working fine. If I open up any browser, just give it a sec for it to load. Okay, so let's say if I want to go to example to facebook.com, Just taking a bit of time, just a second. So you can see that I just use a different browser, which is Mozilla. I try to access facebook.com from here, and it is popping up that particular login portal, like the captive portal authentication, which you have configured, right? So my user was Bob, and let me actually put that username and the password. All right, let's say don't save it for time being, and once I enter the correct credentials, I can go ahead and access Facebook page, which you can see it, right? So this is how it works, right? And for example, if you want to verify the traffic logs, so you can go to the monitor section, you can go to under traffic and check its log over here. Some it's going for the app ZBN override. It might take some of the time. You can also view the logs in the ACC column over here, right, regarding the network activity. Okay, it might take a bit of time, so yeah, under URLs you can check that. You can check based on user as well, so user or user group, let's say for Bob. It might take a bit of time for it to reflect, but yeah, when you do that, it will show it to you. Okay. You can also check the logs inside the traffic or inside this. You can see that the source user is Bob. Look for this, right? 10.1.1.16, right? So it tries to access the Facebook page. It's appearing here. You can also look for that in the session browser. Okay, but my firewall is licensed, so I can see that inside my traffic logs. All right, so I hope this is clear and you will be able to configure the same. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next lecture.